The sun hung high over the suburban neighborhood, casting a golden glow on neatly manicured lawns and picture-perfect homes. It was a typical Saturday morning, filled with weekend chores and the gentle buzz of lawnmowers in the distance. I had parked my truck, a rugged, no-nonsense pickup, just outside my house, its presence adding a touch of grit to the otherwise polished street. Little did I know that my simple choice of parking space would set off a chain reaction that would reveal an unexpected twist. As I sipped my coffee and surveyed the morning bustle, I noticed a couple of HOA board members walking towards my truck, heads together and gesturing animatedly. A sense of foreboding washed over me. This was not the first time they'd taken issue with vehicles in our community. They were known for their zealous enforcement of the rules concerning everything from fence heights to vehicle appearances. My truck, with its paint chipped from years of constant use and adventure, definitely fell outside their ideal aesthetic. Moments later, I overheard them discussing plans to tow it away, claiming it was a violation of our community's strict policies. My heart raced as I processed their intention. After all, it didn't dawn on them that the vehicle they deemed unsightly was owned by someone with far more authority than they realized. It was time for me to step in, not just as a concerned resident, but as the very CEO of the towing company they hoped to hire. The irony of the situation unfolded before me like a script from a comedy. This would surely be an interesting confrontation. The truck in question was far from ordinary. It stood out with its robust build and a layer of protective mud from recent off-road adventures, a badge of honor for someone like me who cherished both utility and the thrill of exploration. It was a 2015 Ford F-250, painted a deep shade of forest green that had faded slightly over the years, giving it a character that reflected my own journey through life. The bed was outfitted with all the essentials for weekend projects: a sturdy toolbox, ropes, and even a small cooler ready for any spontaneous outing. At first glance, one might see an eyesore. The chipped paint along the edges and a dent in the rear fender spoke of countless road trips taken and obstacles overcome. But to me, this truck was more than a vehicle. It was a trusty companion that had carried me through both work and play, from hauling equipment for my towing business to navigating off-the-beaten-path trails during family camping trips. As I leaned against it sipping my coffee, I couldn't help but feel proud of its rugged exterior. The faded decals from previous jobs were mere reminders of past endeavors rather than blemishes to hide. Unfortunately, those very imperfections were likely what prompted the HOA's scrutiny. Their rigid adherence to uniformity didn't account for personal stories embedded in well-worn vehicles like mine. The thought that they would attempt to have it towed stirred something in me, an irritation at their lack of appreciation for individuality in favor of conformity. This wasn't just about parking rules. It was about understanding the value behind every scratched surface and dented panel. The Homeowners Association (HOA) held a tight grip on the community, priding itself on maintaining a pristine and uniform aesthetic. Their rules were meticulously outlined in a lengthy handbook that every resident was expected to read and adhere to, detailing everything from the size of window flowers to the allowed colors for house paints. Vehicles in particular were under close scrutiny. Their stance was clear: no signs of wear, no rough edges. Anything less than perfect was seen as a blight on the neighborhood's image. The board members relished their roles as enforcers of these regulations. With an almost militaristic diligence, they patrolled the streets during weekend mornings, armed with clipboards and no-nonsense attitudes. To them, my well-worn truck represented everything they stood against, a deviation from their idyllic vision. They were determined to restore what they perceived as order by any means necessary. On that particular Saturday, as I observed them inch closer to my property, I could sense their eagerness. They had likely received complaints about my vehicle, perhaps from neighbors who preferred the sleek lines of newer models parked in pristine driveways over my battle-scarred truck. The HOA saw it not just as an eyesore but as a threat to community cohesion, a disruption in their carefully curated narrative of suburbia. Their readings of these situations lacked nuance. They failed to acknowledge that life sometimes gets messy. Real experiences leave their mark. In their pursuit of perfection, they overlooked the very essence of what makes a community vibrant and diverse: individuality in all its forms. I couldn't help but feel both amused and frustrated at this clash of ideals brewing right before me. As the HOA board members drew closer, I could feel the tension in the air shift. Their conversation turned from hushed tones to pointed discussions about taking action against my truck. One member, a particularly zealous enforcer named Margaret, gestured emphatically at the vehicle, her clipboard clutched tightly in hand. "That thing is an eyesore. It has to go," she exclaimed, her voice loud enough for me to hear through my window. I decided it was time to step outside and confront the situation head-on. As I opened the door, the sunlight glinted off the truck's faded hood, and I felt a surge of determination. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Approaching them with a calm demeanor, I introduced myself with a nod. "Good morning. What seems to be the issue?" The surprise on their faces was almost comical as they recognized me. They fumbled through their notes while trying to maintain an air of authority. "Your truck here is in violation of our community standards," Margaret managed to stammer, attempting to regain her composure. I couldn't help but chuckle lightly, sensing that this was not going to unfold as they had anticipated. "Actually, I'm aware of those rules," I said with a smirk. "And I also happen to be the CEO of the towing company you're planning to hire for this little endeavor." Their expressions shifted from indignation to confusion, and I could almost hear the gears turning in their heads as they processed this revelation. The initial conflict had kicked off. I was prepared for a showdown that would challenge their assumptions and perhaps even redefine their perspective on conformity versus individuality. The moment hung in the air, charged with disbelief and awkwardness as I stood before the HOA board members. Their faces shifted from indignation to surprise as they processed my words. I could see the realization dawning on them, and it was almost comical to witness their self-assured facade begin to crack. Margaret's mouth opened slightly, her clipboard trembling in her hands, as if grappling with the implications of my revelation. "Wait, you're serious?" she finally stammered, clearly struggling to reconcile the image of a rebellious truck owner with that of a corporate executive. "You're the CEO of the towing company?" Her incredulous tone was tinged with a mix of confusion and regret. I nodded slowly, letting the weight of the moment sink in. "Indeed, I am," I replied, allowing a slight smile to form on my lips. "And I'm quite familiar with our community's towing policies." The irony was delicious. Here they were, ready to have my vehicle towed without any awareness of who they were dealing with. The remaining board members exchanged glances that seemed to convey panic and uncertainty about their next move. This confrontation had flipped their authority on its head. They had come to enforce rules without understanding the person behind the truck, someone who not only knew those regulations but also had the power to enforce them from an entirely different angle. As they fumbled for words, attempting to regain control over the situation, I sensed an opportunity. It was time to challenge their beliefs about conformity and individuality directly. "Perhaps we can have a conversation about what truly makes a community vibrant," I suggested, ready to turn this confrontation into a dialogue that might reshape their narrow perspective. The air was thick with tension as the HOA board members processed this unexpected turn of events. Initially, their expressions flickered between disbelief and irritation, unable to reconcile the notion that they were dealing with someone who could turn their plans upside down so effortlessly. Margaret, who had taken the lead in advocating for my truck's removal, shifted uncomfortably on her feet, her authoritative stance evaporating faster than she could assemble a rebuttal. I wasn't aware," she faltered, clearly struggling to regain her composure. The other board members looked at each other, their bravado waning as they considered the implications of my status. The power dynamics in the situation had shifted dramatically. They had come prepared to enforce regulations, but now stood in front of someone who could easily flip the script. One member, a man named Tom, cleared his throat and attempted to salvage the situation. "Well, we appreciate your understanding of the rules, but still your vehicle does stand out," he said lamely, trying to maintain some control. It was evident he was grasping at straws, desperately trying to uphold the narrative they'd crafted around community standards. I seized the moment and replied with a friendly tone, "That's precisely why I believe we should have this conversation. Let's explore how our community can appreciate uniqueness while still adhering to essential guidelines." Their initial reaction had morphed from hostility into uncertainty, and I could sense their willingness to engage. After all, they were no longer confronting just any truck owner but a potential ally, someone who could provide insights that might reshape their rigidity. As we stood there, the sunny day suddenly felt warmer and less adversarial. Perhaps this clash would lead to a broader understanding of what it means to be part of a community where diversity is celebrated rather than suppressed. As the conversation unfolded, the legal and ethical implications of the HOA's actions became increasingly apparent. Here was a group of individuals who, in their zeal to uphold community standards, had overlooked the fundamental rights of a homeowner. Their attempt to tow my vehicle without due consideration could potentially lead to a lawsuit, one that would highlight not just their overreach but also their ignorance of the very regulations they claim to enforce. I couldn't help but ponder the ethical ramifications as well. The HOA's rigid adherence to aesthetic uniformity bordered on discrimination against vehicles like mine, which told a story of adventure and personal experience. If they were willing to target my truck solely based on its appearance, what other biases were lurking beneath the surface? This situation exposed an unsettling truth. Their rules, while seemingly benign, were being applied selectively, creating an environment where conformity crushed individuality. The realization dawned on me that this confrontation wasn't merely about my truck, it was emblematic of broader societal issues regarding personal expression and community governance. I decided then that this was not only an opportunity to defend my rights, but also a chance to advocate for a more inclusive approach within the HOA. Let's consider revising these regulations, I proposed, my tone resolute yet inviting. Why not establish guidelines that celebrate diversity rather than suppress it? We could focus on fostering a community where both beauty and individuality coexist. As I spoke, I could see the board members absorbing my words, their expressions shifting from defensiveness to contemplation. Perhaps this moment could catalyze a much-needed dialogue about what it truly meant to live in community. A space where every voice mattered and every story was valued. As the conversation progressed, murmurs began to ripple through the community. Neighbors who had initially assumed my truck was an unsightly nuisance were starting to gather, drawn outside by the commotion. They leaned against fences and peered from behind curtains, curious about what was sparking this unexpected confrontation between a homeowner and the HOA. Some faces lit up with recognition as they realized who I was. Others looked puzzled, unsure of how to interpret the scene unfolding before them. Whispers turned into conversations, and soon I could hear snippets of support filtering through the crowd. Finally, someone is standing up to them, one neighbor remarked, while another added, "It's about time we talked about our rules." As the board members faced mounting pressure from onlookers, their previous confidence began to dissipate further. I seized the moment to address my neighbors directly, inviting them to join in the conversation. "This is not just about my truck," I said, gesturing towards the gathering crowd. "It's about how we define our community. We should be celebrating each other's uniqueness rather than stifling it." A wave of murmurs resonated among my fellow homeowners, some nodding in agreement. The dynamic was shifting. The HOA was no longer simply upholding rules. They were now being challenged by a community that seemed eager for change. People began sharing their own stories of feeling sidelined by rigid standards, revealing an undercurrent of discontent that had been simmering for quite some time. At that moment, it felt like a collective awakening. We were beginning to articulate a shared vision of a community where diversity wasn't just accepted but embraced. The HOA members stood amidst the unraveling dialogue, realizing that their authority was no longer unquestioned. What had started as a confrontation over a truck had transformed into a rallying point for a larger discussion about the values and identity of our neighborhood. As the conversation continued, a palpable shift occurred within the gathered crowd. The HOA board members, now cornered by both their own policies and the overwhelming support for embracing diversity, began to reconsider their stance. I could see Margaret's face flush with frustration as the community's voices rose in agreement with my suggestions. This was no longer just a dispute about my truck. It had evolved into a pivotal moment for our neighborhood. During a brief pause in the conversation, I took a moment to outline a proposal for revising the existing HOA guidelines. Let's establish an open forum where residents can share their thoughts on how we can maintain community standards while celebrating individuality, I suggested, my voice steady but filled with optimism. We could create a committee dedicated to ensuring that all residents feel represented and valued. The board members exchanged worried glances, clearly realizing that maintaining the status quo was no longer feasible. Tom, who had previously tried to salvage their authority, finally spoke up. Perhaps there is merit in reevaluating our rules, he conceded, albeit reluctantly. A committee could help us find a balance between aesthetics and personal expression. Cheers erupted from the crowd, and I smiled at the unexpected turn of events. It felt like we had collectively reclaimed our neighborhood from the rigid grasp of conformity. By the end of our discussion, the HOA members had agreed to host a community meeting, facilitating an inclusive dialogue about new guidelines that would recognize the beauty of diversity. As they walked away, visibly humbled but more open-minded, I couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. What started as a confrontation had blossomed into an opportunity for collaboration and growth, a true testament to the power of community spirit echoing through our neighborhood. Reflecting on the events that had unfolded, it became clear that several important lessons emerged from this unexpected confrontation. First and foremost, the power of community cannot be underestimated. When residents come together, they can challenge the status quo and reshape their collective identity. It was heartening to witness my neighbors stepping out of their comfort zones, sharing personal stories that highlighted a shared desire for a community that values uniqueness rather than conformity. The incident also revealed the need for effective communication within community. The HOA's rigid enforcement of aesthetic standards had created a chasm between board members and residents, leading to misunderstandings and resentment. Dialogue fosters understanding. It encourages members to express their perspectives freely. By proposing an open forum for discussion, we not only addressed immediate concerns, but also laid a foundation for ongoing conversations about change and collaboration. Additionally, I learned that sometimes the fiercest battles are fought not with anger but with empathy. When I stood in front of the HOA board that day, rather than simply defending my truck, I chose to advocate for inclusivity, an approach that ultimately transformed a confrontation into a constructive dialogue. Lastly, there was a recognition of the importance of being adaptable. The HOA board members were initially resistant, but demonstrated a willingness to listen when faced with community support. This adaptability is crucial in governance. Rules should evolve with the community they serve rather than remain static and suppressive. In the end, what began as an attempt to tow my truck became a catalyst for change, illustrating how adversity can lead to greater understanding and collaboration within a community dedicated to celebrating its diversity while maintaining harmony. Ultimately, we had taken strides toward creating an environment where every voice could be heard and valued. In conclusion, the unexpected confrontation over my truck not only revealed the absurdity of rigid rules, but also served as a powerful catalyst for change within our community. What began as a potential conflict quickly transformed into a meaningful dialogue about inclusivity, individuality, and the values we wish to uphold as neighbors. Through open communication and a willingness to listen, we discovered that our community's strength lies in its diversity. As residents rallied together, it became evident that many shared a desire for a more welcoming environment, one where unique stories and experiences are celebrated rather than stifled. The engagement from my neighbors illuminated not just their support for my truck, but also their own struggles with feeling marginalized by the HOA's stringent standard. This collective voice prompted the board members to reconsider their approach and acknowledge the need for regulations that reflect our community's character and aspiration. The commitment to foster inclusivity was encapsulated in our plan to establish ongoing forums for residents to voice their opinions and contribute to shaping community guidelines. As we move forward, it will be essential to maintain this spirit of collaboration, ensuring that every resident feels valued and heard. Ultimately, this experience reinforces the notion that governance should adapt to the people it serves. By embracing individuality while still aiming for a cohesive community, we can create an environment that thrives on mutual respect and understanding. With each step we take toward this goal, we reinforce the idea that communities are at their best when they celebrate differences rather than enforce uniformity, transforming not just policies but lives in the process.